A warm welcome to this inaugural virtual panel seminar on behalf of the University of London. I'm Peter Kopelman. I'm the President of Development for the University. The original plan was to hold a conventional meeting in Singapore in April, looking at well-being and healthy living, but then the coronavirus pandemic struck. And although the world suddenly and dramatically changed, we remain keen to reach out to our valued community of alumni, and more particularly to capture in real time the experiences of remaining fit and well despite an extended lockdown. Hence the title, Surviving and Thriving in a Pandemic, Wellbeing in a Time of Crisis. We have 4 exceptional speakers this evening, experts in their own right, who will bring their perceptions of living in a pandemic in short presentations. We will then have a discussion on some of the issues that will come out from the presentations, and we invite questions and comments from you, the audience. Let me introduce our panel. Firstly, we have Zi Yung Kang, who is the Chief Executive of Singapore's Health Promotion Board. We have Kon Ying Tong, who is in his own right a distinguished accountant, but for this evening is going to talk about Sport Singapore. And Aisha Menon, who is the founder and principal HR consultant of AM Talent Partners and an independent talent resources and industrial relations consultancy. And then finally, we have Barry Smith, who is Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Institute of Philosophy in the University of London School of Advanced Study. May I invite Zi to kick off this evening's proceedings?
Thank you, Peter. We speak in very interesting and difficult times. And as a public health official, this is something that is doubly so. First, public health, startlingly, has moved from a very worthy but slightly boring topic for everyone to something that is probably top of the mind under probably very unfortunate circumstances. But secondly, also, like everyone else, our business priorities have totally upended. Our world has changed too. For the most part, public health officials in the world have been focused on chronic disease prevention, with infectious disease being very much a minor part of our work. And of course, that priority has upended. But in a fundamental way, the challenge for us remains strangely unchanged. And what do I mean? For chronic disease prevention, the answer to our problems are actually very simple. We tell people to eat properly, to exercise frequently, to sleep sufficiently, and not to smoke. These are very simple injunctions, but they are extremely difficult to obey, because they go against our very human nature. And of course, to do the things that we want people to do also goes against the entire grain of how our society and our economies are set up. And in a very strange but parallel way, in these pandemic times, telling people how to take care of themselves also involves the observance of some very, very simple injunctions, right? Wear a mask, maintain a good social distance, don't go to public places, crowded places, wash your hands frequently, just observe simple hygiene. And again, we are left with a very small set of very simple injunctions, but which are extremely hard to get people to follow, because they go against the very grain of our personalities, our societies, the entire way in which our economies and livelihoods are structured and built on. And it has been challenging. And yet, the same challenges that we face when we try to get people to observe the kinds of behaviors that will preserve health for chronic diseases. And let us not be mistaken, for the most part, in this fight against the coronavirus, until a vaccine comes, until we have much better treatment regimes, it is an issue of prevention. That the challenge then is how to get people to do the things that is not naturally the case. And we've been dragging out the same kind of strategies that we have been using in the war against chronic disease, in this war against COVID-19. We talk about public education, telling people what to do. We talk about regulations, putting people in prison sometimes, for flouting social distancing rules or fining them or putting the police on them. But I think in each of these cases, the most powerful tool, as has emerged all over the world, are not the tools of public education. They are not the tools of regulation. Actually, they are the tools of social norms. There's no amount of police work that can be effective to chase down everyone who's not behaving responsibly in terms of maintaining social distance, being hygienic, caring for your fellow citizens. It is the pressure of feeling that you want to behave in a way that is to be seen to be part of a responsible society, not wanting to put your fellow citizens in harm's way. I think that has kept us largely, well, I think out of the worst scenarios in terms of death and disease. I mean, you look at some of these numbers that were initially projected. I think despite the great tragedy that's happened to all of us, we have averted a much greater tragedy because I think people, for the most part, in most societies, of their own volition, have behaved responsibly. And you see that in some societies, politicians, I think, under understandable pressure to reopen societies from lockdown, you see that in many of these societies, people have continued without the force of law to maintain good hygiene standards out of their own volition. And they have exerted social pressure openly, or maybe less so, in the case of some internet vigilantes, trying to out people who have not behaved the way they wanted to, or maybe sort of berating people in the streets whom they seen as not to be responsible. But in various ways that people have clubbed together to create a new set of social norms that then allows us as a society then to behave in this very unfamiliar and strange way. And I think the weight of our collective norming will probably be the best defense against this pandemic. So with this, I would like to hand over to our next speaker. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much indeed. So we turn now to Ying Tong. Ying Tong is going to talk more about the sports element in relation to the pandemic.
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. Basically, COVID has red-carded sport. Referees and players have been sent off. All sports facilities remain closed, and some turned into dormitories housing foreign workers. It is difficult to say with certainty what will happen when restrictions are fully eased, if they ever are. But one thing is certain, it won't be the same when we come round from this induced coma. Sport has many benefits, there's no doubt about that. However, its resumption should not compromise public health, which remains a top priority. Because resources used in the resumption and monitoring of sport means resources like logistics, healthcare, enforcement diverted from elsewhere more pressing. And prevention is better than cure. With this background, let me share with you how Singapore can get back in the game. It will be measured and it will be risk sensitive. If we split sport into three categories, we can fine-tune our return to sport. First, we have competitive commercial sport, or professional sports with consumers and spectators. Second, we have competitive amateur sport. And third, we have grassroots sport. I take grassroots sport first. First, because of its reach and because general health and fitness is part of total defense against COVID. We will open facilities where there is a lower risk for COVID transmission, with safeguards like tracking and safe distancing. Initially, these settings may include running tracks, swimming pools, and workout areas. Additional risk mitigation will be applied to indoor activities. We will also start with smaller groups. We limit the sizes of participants and look closely at vulnerable groups like the senior citizens. For amateur sport, many of the considerations for the resumption of grassroots sport will also apply. Sports with no deliberate body contact have a lower risk than those with deliberate body contact. Restrictions should be lifted first for these sports. We will sharpen the knife differently for different sports. There is also another category of non-contact sports like December Standard Chartered Marathon, with about 50,000 runners. It is the antithesis of social distancing. Socially distanced mass participation events are an oxymoron. If it goes ahead, we may have to limit participants to an optimum number. For professional sport, we have the issues of amateur sports and more. Professional sports refer mainly to international sports events, for example, the HSBC Singapore Sevens and the Singapore Premier League. Professionals must be trained and be match fit to play sport safely. Banning high transmission risk training like tackling is possible, though its effectiveness needs to be assessed. And obviously, more regular testing is also needed. Contingency considerations like what happens when a player tests positive and had been training or playing a match need to be resolved as well. Who do we isolate? Do we use wearable GPS trackers to determine the type and length of contact, for example? Do employers need players' agreements for the risks they are taking? For rugby sevens, unfortunately, every host country needs to be ready. Otherwise, there will be no Seven Series. There will be no Singapore Sevens. Moving parts like travel and quarantine restrictions add complexity. COVID does not respect national boundaries. Much of sport today is globalized, and it cannot overcome the impact of the virus without everyone cooperating. Each country has its own unique COVID exit strategy with different regulations. And governments need to coordinate these regulations and agree on safety and health standards, medical protocol, and exemptions for such events to take place. There is not much clarity how this can happen at the moment. In mitigation, we can play with no crowd, but that is no longer commercial. Access to live coverage can increase, but the viability of closed-door events is questionable. We have been addressing the supply side of the equation. We need to look at the demand side as well. What the public and fans really want. Not many will pay to see Federer play an e-match against Djokovic, but esports bring many possibilities. One final consideration that applies to sports is education. I know Z says it's not really education, it's societal norms, but really education, I think, is the beginning. It's a start, and we need that. Education on risk mitigation strategies is crucial. Education will promote and set expectations for behavior prior to restarting activities. We will have to manage public expectations and fears. We have to shape behavior. If we are not educated properly, if we cannot behave responsibly, the consequences can be quite disastrous. We can have wave after wave of pandemics. Freedom to watch or participate in sport comes with obligations and responsibilities. For example, continual tracking. And some say it is curtailing civil liberties. That is the new not quite normal. I think putting food on the table and minimizing public health risks are not mutually exclusive. There needs to be some give and take. We need to adapt to protect lives and livelihoods to get back in the game. So thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ying Tong. And we'll now turn to Asha, who's going to talk more about the impact in relation to jobs and people's expectations and careers and so forth. Over to you, Asha.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everybody. Unlike Z, Ying Tong, and Barry, I think I'm going to be sharing a very generic perspective. I would be drawing, some examples from my own personal experiences and maybe touch on some of the work aspects as well. So looking back, it's been a topsy-turvy start to the year 2020. And, I had so many plans, travel included, scaling up my services and business, and then suddenly everything has come to a halt. So much for the vision, 2020, especially for Malaysia. We were looking forward to the vision 2020 that was set like 2 decades ago, and a hope for a global economy rise. But unfortunately, COVID-19, came about, and it has brought everything to a halt. But the way I look at it really is what COVID-19 has done. It has really accelerated the speed of innovation, and with it comes many disruptions that we are all trying to brace through this very challenging period. It has significantly changed the contours of not just our personal, but professional lives as well. And I see the impact of coronavirus crisis could ripple through every layer of our social fabric. So for me personally, what that means is the new way of working, as we are all in this, remote working situation, suddenly overnight, it just happened, right? The shift from online to offline. It's not a shock to my system per se, or it's not new to me, because I have been operating remotely mostly in the last 2.5 years since I left the corporate world, and while serving clients from all around the globe. But here's the thing, I have lobbied this agenda for the longest time when I was back in corporate, but always received pushbacks from leadership teams. So with a tinge of guilt, I'm saying this. I am so pleased and happy that many have jumped on the bandwagon finally, albeit the circumstances and not based out of preference, but due to necessity. I hope that the whole fulfillment and the experience, it's not compromised, because when you don't have a BCP plan in place or you've not tested one, and you are supposed to actually jump on this bandwagon, on this remote working agenda by necessity. And I just hope that that doesn't take away the pleasure of having that flexible working arrangements. But here's the thing I believe in. We humans are so resilient, we are a resilient bunch, flexible and adaptable species. We have faced crises before and will continue to do so in the future. So every crisis is actually a test of our own mental toughness, stability, and the ability to bounce back stronger and better. And I'd like to actually draw an analogy. If you look at when you're standing in the boxing ring, and similarly in life, the defeat is not declared when you fall down. It is declared only when you refuse to get up or to wake up, right? So when we are no longer able to change the situation and we are challenged to change ourselves, and this is a perfect opportunity to really embrace change. And so you can actually choose to either be a catalyst or to be a victim. With that, I will hand over back to Peter and probably share some insights a little bit based on the questions.
Asha, thank you very much indeed. It's always good to have a more positive view on the current crisis. I turn now to Barry, who is a philosopher by background, but what he's going to talk about is much beyond philosophy.
Peter, thank you, and hello to everyone. I'm delighted to be here with such illustrious fellow speakers on the panel. I'm going to talk to you about an aspect of our everyday lives which has suddenly become more relevant during our strange current pandemic crisis, and that's the everyday experience of eating and drinking. Now, this is something that I was interested in from my own research. As Peter says, I'm a philosopher, and we worry about perception and how our senses put us in touch with the world around us. And at the University of London, we have a centre for the study of the senses, where we bring about interactive working between philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists who look at how our senses work and look at how they put us in touch with our environment and also in touch with ourselves. And the part I work on there is on taste, smell, and flavor perception. So I'm interested in these neglected senses. Everybody works on vision. There's a lot of work on hearing and audition, a bit on touch, but taste and smell often get neglected. And yet I'm very interested in how they work to deliver everyday experiences of the taste of a dish, the pleasure of a wine, some of the things that add to our pleasures and also determine our food choices. So one of the things I know from my neuroscience colleagues is that when we taste something, it's not just using the sense of taste. It's always taste, touch, and smell. It's a combination. And the largest part of that is smell. And that has led me in my work to start studying some of the neuroscience of smell, the neurobiology of smell, which is fascinating, underexplored, and a little bit of a Cinderella area. It's had far less attention than the neuroscience of vision and than much of the rest of philosophy of perception. And so I was going on with my work and suddenly struck by the pandemic when I came to realize that there were many reports coming out by people whose only symptom was the sudden loss of smell, and they reported loss of taste and smell. With that, of course, came the realization that they were losing appetite. They didn't want to eat. And at that point, lots of the chemosensory researchers, people interested in the chemical senses, decided to get together, and we very quickly emailed each other and put together a global consortium of chemosensory researchers that went on very suddenly and very quickly to understand this connection between COVID-19 and loss of smell. We've since published a 99 author article which looks at this connection and establishes there is a very clear connection. I worked with ENT colleagues at the University of London, across the Federation, at UCL, and with Tim Spector and his colleagues at King's, and we looked at the incidence of smell loss and how prevalent it was in the population who had coronavirus. Now, having come from a part of the philosophy and neuroscience of the senses that was much neglected, we are suddenly in a position to have people taking a tremendous interest in the sense of smell. And one of the things we have to explain to them very quickly is that when people say, I've lost my ability to taste food, I usually say to them, well, I wonder if you have, or whether it's just your sense of smell. Try putting a bit of salt on your tongue, or sugar, or lemon juice. Can you taste that? And they say, oh yes, but that's all I can taste. And now they realize how much of what they thought of as tasting was in fact due to smell. So there's an increased understanding of how smell is important to eating, but also people are realizing without the sense of smell, the world seems a little less bright. They do not recognize the places and people around them, and they feel as though something is lacking emotionally. And so it's highlighted for a lot of people now, the importance of their sense of smell. Thanks, Peter.
All right, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to you in a moment on that. Can I turn first to Asher? It's young people that, in a sense, the memory of this crisis is going to be crucial, because pandemics won't happen that often, but it may well happen again in their lifetime. But of course, I mean, all of us, I think, have had friends, families, daughters and sons who've suddenly lost their jobs as a consequence, having had, you know, what they thought was good, secure and well paid employment. What are your thoughts for those individuals? You say that, you know, they're on the floor in the boxing ring at the present time. How can they bounce back?
Sure, thanks, Peter. So I actually call them the class of COVID-19, or the crisis cohort. Very unfortunate. I've personally have friends whose kids have just graduated, and just being able to see that on social media where they go up, standing in front of the TV and kind of pretending to shake hands and wearing a graduation hat, and that's it. It finishes off in 5 minutes. But I think the bleak prospect of unemployment and layoffs as the economy staggers back to growth is expected to persist at least for 2 years. This is what researchers say. So in terms of job prospects, it's melting right now. But here's my personal advice, especially being in the human resources domain. I think young adults or fresh graduates have to really leverage on this period and really upskill and reskill themselves in order to be ready when the job market opens up again. So this is a perfect opportunity where they could actually be focusing on positioning themselves for the fast re-entry into the job market when conditions begin to restabilize, right? So when you kind of look at across industries, some of the industries obviously aren't doing so well, or they're kind of really laying off people, but you kind of really see the thriving industries like the pharmaceutical industries, the e-commerce industries, that's really, thriving right now because everybody's kind of like shifting to online, food ordering. They are moving towards buying stuff online. So the e-commerce market is really booming. So even though someone is graduating from, for example, you have a qualification from the aviation industry or some sort of travel, tourism, F&B industry, you really want to take this advantage right now to reskill yourself. That means using this time to equip yourself with some life skills that would really help you to stand out and be different from the crowd, because employers these days, we're kind of just not looking at paper qualification. We're kind of really looking at the social intelligence, the level of humility, empathy, and the soft skills that is going to help a person through dealing and coping with real life issues.
That's very helpful. I mean, I suppose the other question would be about the service industry, but we'll come back to that. Yingtong, I'm interested in relation to sports. Sport is very much a spectator event as well as a competitive, and it's very much a spectacle. Your thoughts how things may develop, because if you recall, we were supposed to have Olympics this year. It's been postponed for another year. Do you ever think that those sort of events will be quite the same, or do you think there will be a continuing nervousness about major events and major crowds going to sporting events?
Do well. We want our athletes to do well. And from a safe management perspective, we have set up designated training centers or training bubbles. I think in the UK, they call it a biosecure environment. So we've got training bubbles to provide a safe training environment for athletes and coaches. The Olympians and the Paralympians have first priority to use these training bubbles. I think in Singapore, there are about 32 of them. And my understanding is that the other countries around the world have the same arrangement. The focus is on the Olympians because they want the Olympians to win the gold medals. They want them to bring honor for the country and so on. The issue is this: high performance athletes peak during competition. So it is going back to the drawing board in the sense that we have to adjust training regimes and schedules to peak in July or August 2021. It could be a blessing in disguise for some because there'll be more time to prepare. It also entails more costs. So far, all the additional funding for training grants, coaching grants, funds for sports medicine and science that have come to me have been approved. For some others, Tokyo was not in the plans for 2021, and the bodies perhaps cannot take it anymore at a high level. So we need to have conversations with these athletes to see how best we can work things out. But one thing is certain, we want all our athletes who fly the Singapore flag while competing at the Olympics to do well. And we have spared no expense so far in ensuring that this is so. But in the longer term, for international sports, even for the Olympics, I alluded to it earlier. We need everyone to work together. It can be done. It requires some effort and some additional funding, and maybe some innovation in the way we organize sports around the world. For example, we have got the regional football tournament called the Suzuki Cup. We may have to play that tournament in a country that welcomes visitors and play over a month or 6 weeks. We have to agree on the safe management measures that need to be in place and so on, but it can be done. So governments around the world, certainly in this region, are keen to get sport moving because it is an important part of nation building. It is an important part of building social capital to create a caring, cohesive and confident nation. So I think most countries, Singapore is no exception, we're all gunning for the Olympics and the long-term future for sports.
Can I turn to Z then, because you talk very much about the new social norms and the expectation that social distancing and respect to some of the advice at the present time is maintained within society. I mean, already in the UK, with a relaxing of the lockdown, we see the beaches are crowded. We see certain people within government who have not respected those requirements. How do you see this being ingrained in a population, and not just the Singaporean population, a population worldwide? And it goes back to that point, if we're going to have an Olympics, then there's presumably going to have to be some sort of social distancing in relation to spectators. How does this become what we now term the new norm, rather than something very different?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And I think that's the challenge that we have, that is the most difficult, because I don't think it's about people being irresponsible. I think it's people being fatigued, and therefore, to maintain an artificial set of behaviors or set of norms, I think it's going to be very difficult. In line with what I said earlier, I think education obviously is important and rules are important, but we see probably the most powerful tools to enforce or encourage new social norms being adopted in many jurisdictions are actually measures such as physical reminders for people to behave in a different way. So, you have big crosses being painted on park benches, restaurants having areas being marked out as being no-go areas, subway trains with clear paths being delineated for people to queue and to maintain a space between each other. I think the environment, the physical environment, probably is the most powerful reminder to people of these new norms. And setting aside facilities that will allow people not to be cramped, not to be cheek by jowl with their neighbors, changing arrangements such as times, office start times, encouraging measures, for example, as Asha said, working from home, allowing people to, no longer have to show up physically for meetings when there's no necessity. I think there are any number of things we can do to ease that process of adapting to this very, very strange world that we have to live in. I think that is probably the most powerful thing we can do. But I think also for us to step away from extremism, I think a lot of the measures that were taken over the last few months, for example, extreme versions of lockdowns, not allowing people even to leave their home at all, whereas most of the evidence seems to suggest that if you're in the outdoors, it's actually pretty safe. I mean, if you maintain social distance, as I said, and some of these more draconian and hastily thought rules that impinge on our enjoyment of life and add pressure unnecessarily, I think we should really, really look at why they should be in place in the first place.
See, that leads very nicely into a question I want to ask Barry, because it is that sort of tension between empirical science and what I'd call the more pragmatic, sort of the humanities. Barry had enormous difficulties in the UK persuading government that alterations in taste and smell were a symptom of COVID-19. And I think that showed the, if I can use the term, the sniffiness of some scientists. Barry, how do you see things going for the future? How do you see society adapting to this new normality?
That's a good question. I mean, I think in line with what the other speakers have been talking about, a couple of things to reflect on. One, Z's absolutely right that we had this amazing collective behavioral experiment, and it was a collective action. It was mass participation by not seeing one another. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. You know, here we were performing a collective action by being alone in our house and not meeting up. So that's a very funny thing to do, but it was definitely driven by recognition of the norms that I was protecting you, you were protecting me. It was the right thing to do for everyone. Coming out of that, where the risks are rather different and the risks have to be calculated, I think that's going to be interesting because it's not so easy to have a single norm. There will be risky behavioral people and there'll be those who are slightly, more worried. But one thing that worries me, and I think this gets to both something that Asha said and Yingtong said, if you take sport, I mean, all of us have been in a funny experiment where we must be deconditioning our bodies quite a lot. We know when astronauts are in space, they're in microgravity or zero gravity, their muscles waste away, there are huge changes to the body, they decondition. They're not in the same physical situation to be active and able to move and do what they used to do. Some of us are now finding it quite exhausting to have a reasonably long walk and to go collect groceries and bring them back. We think it's an epic journey. So goodness knows what it's like for sports people to get into the high peak performance that's required of them when they have they've been training, they've been working from home, but it's still not the same, and all of us are not used to this. The other thing is, I think there's a certain amount of fear and apprehension. I think people going out there will wonder whether things really will settle down and go back to normal. Some people, as Asha said, will have been so excited by being able to do most of their work online and at home, they won't want to come out. They'll think, this is a rather good idea. I want to stay at home. I want to do more of this at home. So I think you'll see a lot of individual difference. You'll see some people desperate to get out there to participate, people wanting to go back to sport, other people being quite reluctant, and a lot of us learning how odd our original lives were and how strange they feel, both to the body and the mind.
Barry, thank you. That actually prompts me, Asha, to ask you that question about service industry. What I was getting at there was tourism. I mean, from the point of view of the university, where we very much enjoy coming out and around the world to visit the alumni, tourism is very important for all of our nations in relation to the economy. How do you see that changing in the coming year?
Wow, I think this is one of the biggest aspects of this entire COVID-19 in my life personally, is that it has such a big impact because I'm an avid traveler. And not being able to travel, I think I'm really itching right now. So I take a personal interest in trying to follow updates from the travel industry. And I'm also part of the Zafigo Travel Forum in Malaysia, where basically it's a travel platform created for solo travelers. And I've been getting a lot of updates to say that I think most likely that travel is going to start opening up from July onwards. That's the prediction, but it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be, the experience of traveling is no longer going to be the same because of all the additional compliance that we'll need to keep up with in order to even, set our foot on the plane right now. So definitely it is something that will recover, but probably it's going to take a very long time before it's fully recovered. So steps like, if you are turning up at the airport 3 hours before flight, right now probably you'll need to allocate like 5 hours before your flight takes off. And you would probably in addition to your passport, you would probably need to carry a digital health passport. That's in the pipeline, I hear. And they're coming up with rapid test kits. If airlines want to start opening up again, then they would have to definitely invest obviously with the approval from the Ministry of Health and partnering with the aviation aerospace authorities effectively to test kits, which will tell you whether you are carrying an infection or not. So I think you have got to be prepared that if you are willing to travel, you have to take into consideration of all these additional factors and could be even putting yourself out there to the risk of, privacy and entrenchment and surveillance technology being very intrusive. And, so that's something that, we would have to really learn to live with if we want to continue to travel.
See, can I come back to you? Because you started by saying public health was always considered to be a worthy but boring topic. Far from it now. I mean, presumably, from a Singapore perspective, tourism is incredibly important, but it must be quite a high risk on your risk register.
Well, to your point and to Asha's point, and there's a fair amount of nuance in that area. And the reason why I want to say this is from an epidemiological perspective. If someone travels from one country to another that has the same prevalence of COVID, there is no risk, increase in risk, right? It's no different from someone who is, mathematically moving from one part of the country to another. The risk may come in the process of traveling, but it's no different if you're on a plane versus then maybe you are in a subway train, right? But if, for example, Singapore and Korea has the same prevalence of COVID, opening up travel between Singapore and Korea would not increase the COVID risk. And strangely enough, if you have a high prevalence country like the US, opening up travel, say to Brazil, and we saw Trump sort of closing travel, actually, there's no increase in risk. So we envisage a world potentially for people who want to travel where you've read about this, there are travel bubbles, right? Where countries with similar prevalences are now looking at reopening travel, first starting with business travel, but I think down the road, happily for Asha, is even tourism, where people then can resume that exchange of people. And then over time, hopefully, as the world comes down in terms of the COVID prevalence to a level where we can all tolerate the risk, that day will come when normal service resumes. But right now, because there's so much fear, when you reopen these channels, even between countries that have the same prevalence, there is a lot of public opposition. It's not irrational. Yeah.
Yes, I'm going to turn to Yingtong because sport is so much an international activity. Your thoughts?
Yeah, just taking up from where Z left off about tourism. The last figures I saw about sports tourism around the world, I think the figure was about $8 billion a year, which is huge. Singapore wants to be a global sports hub, obviously. In terms of sports tourism, I mentioned the HSBC Rugby Sevens. That's a big one. Obviously, the Singapore Formula One, the F1, is a big event. If these two events are canned or cancelled because of COVID, I think that puts a big dent on the sports tourism scene in Singapore. There are a number of consequences because of that. If the tourists or the sports tourists don't come to Singapore anymore, we're going to lose critical mass. We're going to lose the expertise. We're going to lose a lot of freelancers, those who are in the gig economy. We're going to lose a lot of the amenities, that are built around these sports tourism concepts. will be ivory towers. I think that's a big worry. The other big worry affecting sports around the world, in Singapore and certainly for sports tourism, is de-globalization. Some call it localization, like working from home. So in Singapore's context, those of you who know Singapore, when we built satellite towns, we meant for the locals to live, stay, and work and go to school in those towns without travel and so on. So with de-globalization, with localization, Singapore doesn't have a big market. So where would the F1s go to? They will go to America, they will go to the UK, Europe, China maybe. Would they come to Singapore? Maybe not, unless we've got travel bubbles, unless many of the tourists have got immunity passports. They won't come to Singapore. Singapore is just not a large enough market to sustain an F1 race on its own. So there are many threats because of COVID that go beyond just the next 2 years and lockdowns and so on. So we have to be careful of what the impact is for the long term. We need to plan for that. I don't think we are certain what will happen at the end of the day, but we still need to plan for that.
Barry, just turning to you, we are very much living through history at the present time. When they come to write the history of this period, or maybe when you write your autobiography, what would the chapter on COVID-19 include? What are your sort of thoughts about lessons learnt and what we should do for the future?
Gosh, that's an awfully big question. It might have to wait until my autobiography. But I mean, let me just pick up on a few things and then try to take your question on. Terribly worried if Singapore doesn't have the sevens. As an ex-rugby player, I would really miss that a lot. but I also think that if we look at what Z said about the corridors that might exist between countries with equal infection rates or prevalence, you may start to see coalitions taking up the things that are missing and saying, well, we can do it even if you can't. So some of the sport, as you also said, Yingtong, might move. You might see people putting their hand up and saying, we'd rather do it. So I don't think you have to worry about Brazil and the US taking the Grand Prix or the UK just yet. Don't worry about that. But you can see other people moving into that space. And I think, as Asha says, people will be poised for opportunities. They'll think of doing that. I think when we look back at the history, one of the things we'll see is that a lot of us felt it was a time for a reset in the world. There was a way in which this gave us an opportunity to examine the slightly crazy way we were behaving, traveling, the way we were treating one another, the inequalities in health, in race. We will look back on this and say, we really needed to stop and also think, is this how we want our world to be? Is this what we want the future of the world to be? Now, I'm a little bit worried and skeptical, as a philosopher is bound to be. I'm a little bit worried that if we find that there isn't a second spike and that things open up, we would get back to something more like the normal too quickly before we've ironed out some of these remaining issues. Questions of value, you've seen a change there's a change in equality of prestige when you see which workers are now valued, whose services seem to be essential. Quality of esteem has moved from the high earners, from people who are doing glamorous jobs to people who are doing the routine jobs. I don't want that to be lost. So I'm hoping that it is time for a reset, and that if we move slowly and carefully, we will reconsider and we'll think what kind of world we want coming out of it. And if that happens, the history of this period will have an upside, and we'll say COVID-19 was the opportunity to do that.
Barry, thank you very much. Can I just turn to our other speakers? Would they like to make any final comments? I'll start with Asha.
Sure, Peter. For me, the main lessons that I've learned over the last 3 months or so, I would say that I would like to summarize it in this order. So I think necessity is the mother of all inventions. I'm very, very pleased to see within my close circle of friends, where people are reinventing themselves, reimagining the services and thinking out of the box to do. So many brilliant ideas are coming up right now. And that's really very, very good to see. And I also feel that the right to internet access and broadband, that should be considered a human right. So everyone should have access to it, because we live in this time and era where we're so dependent on connectivity, and I think that has become more of a necessity rather than a nice to have. And lastly, on the contrary, while I say that connectivity is so important, but what personally this COVID situation has taught me is I have learned how to be content by being alone. It is really so hard for some people to just be still and do nothing. So by being alone, especially for extroverts, that can be really exhausting and very lonely, and and that's where you see depression sets in. But it's really good to use this time, if you're still in lockdowns, to connect with yourself inwards, to really bring out the things that you would not have the opportunity to do otherwise, your hidden talents, your potential. I think when you start going inwards, being more mindful, being more conscious about your day-to-day activity, you will learn a lot about yourself, and you will learn how to keep yourself busy as well.
Thank you. Ying Tong, final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many life and leadership lessons from COVID, and maybe share one or two. Continual communication and dialogue are important to maintain public trust. And trust is probably the single most valuable asset or most important asset we have in a crisis. And if you show empathy in the communication, our stakeholders, our athletes, our coaches, I think will be appreciative of any drastic action taken. Personally, one of the things I discovered is our capacity to learn and adapt. For example, I know some of my sport people now have pretty good knowledge of vapor dispersion and inhalation, and have used that knowledge to very good effect. And that's very heartening. So there are some silver linings in this COVID thing. Obviously, there is a lot of general uncertainty, and one of the ways to deal with uncertainty is to be prepared for it. You have got to be nimble, to be adaptable, to face the unexpected. And having some tolerance for uncertainty helps to reduce anxiety and stress. So just hang it there. I think we'll get through all this.
Thanks very much, Into. And Z, final words.
Yeah, my organization has been sucked almost entirely into this fight on COVID. We've been tasked to set up the testing infrastructure as Singapore emerges from the lockdown. We have a very aggressive strategy to test almost everyone we think either at risk or who is showing symptoms of respiratory infection. But as we emerge from the lockdown, we will also we are expected to resume many of the old things that we've been doing pre-COVID. And it was very instructive that when we looked at that list of things to do, when we had absolutely no choice but to drop what is not the most important. Of course, the first on the list was, okay, make sure we immunize the kids because we don't want a measles epidemic, right? Or polio to come back. But the second thing that immediately came up was we better resume our program to reach out to lonely people, especially the lonely aged. And that was very instructive. It's times like that when you realize what are the things that most impact human health. It's the psyche.
Thank you very much. Can I thank on behalf of the University of London our speakers this evening. It's been what I considered a very excellent and lively conversation, and there's been some very good points brought out. I mean, I think what it does underline the importance of international collaboration, a clarity and consistency of purpose that is shared across the globe. And I do think that point about connectivity is crucially important. We always think, you know, if we were 10 years ago and we had a pandemic, what would we have done? We've been very fortunate in having that, or we have had that connectivity. Not everybody has had that, and it is so important for the future. I'd like to thank our audience and to thank them for their questions and their comments, and we'd also like feedback because this is our first virtual seminar, but we plan to do many more for the future. Thank you very much.